Welcome back. We're going to dive into the kind of coming down the home stretch, as I've said in the past. We're going to kind of dive in to the issues that impact measuring or estimating or calculating, whatever terminology you want to use, GDP. Whether we're looking at nominal, we're looking at real, depends on which of those numbers that you're most comfortable with, or which ones that you had rather utilize. But again, we're looking at GDP, and we're looking at the measurement issues. So we go back to GDP is a metric that we use to measure the economic well-being of individuals within a given country, within a given nation. And one thing that we tried to do, so we've kind of gone from nominal GDP, which is current prices times current quantities, calculated across the entire spectrum. We've moved there from nominal GDP to real GDP, where we're looking at the calculation of GDP in terms of current quantities and a base year price, trying to take out the impact of inflation or the impact of price increases or price decreases. So we're tagging, or we're pegging that base year for the price. So that's trying to take that piece out of it. And then now we're going to try to figure out, is there a way that we can do something else to help peg that or be more accurate in the way we're calculating GDP? And it really, the well-being of any nation's population, or any of the citizens or residents, or again, whatever terminology you want to use or how you want to calculate it, but whatever the well-being is for a nation across their given population, we're trying to calculate the economic well-being in terms of goods and services produced and consumed. And the nominal GDP is probably the one most commonly used. That's probably the one that you will see when the talking heads are on TV. They just talk about GDP. And when they're talking about just GDP, it's more along the nominal GDP terms. And then when they start talking about real GDP, you know that it's been adjusted by the pegging it on the price of a base year. But so real GDP, as I've said, it filters out the impacts of price changes from year over year and tries to tie it back to that base year. But what if we took real GDP, so nominal to real, and we make one more adjustment on the real GDP? What if we turned it into real GDP per capita? So now we're looking at GDP with the price issues factored out, and now we're trying to use a denominator or a factor of population to drive the true well-being of a country. So you may have a country A that's got the GDP of 5 billion, and you've got country B with the GDP of 1 billion, but by the time you adjust them for the per capita or adjust them for the population, you may, country B may be better off, because while they don't have the magnitude of the GDP, they've got a much smaller population. So the well-being of that population may be significantly better in nation B than it is in nation A. So that's why we're looking at taking and adjusting real GDP by a population. And while it works for some countries like it, other countries don't, but it is an opportunity to adjust that GDP based on population. So now we're going to get into the measurement problems with real GDP. And first off, let's just talk about the revisions. And we've touched briefly on the revisions. So BEA and commerce they calculate on a quarterly basis. So if you're looking at quarter one in 2023, that was January through March, so January the 1st through March 31st, and then a month later in April, they calculate kind of what they call the initial estimate of GDP, or the advanced estimate of GDP. And then a month later, they do another calculation, and a month later, they do a third calculation, and they may do some other calculations on a monthly basis. But typically, Commerce, at least once during the summer, will also do a revision, and then they go back a few years, trying to get the revisions as close as possible, because what you will find are sometimes huge swings or huge variances between that advanced or initial estimate and the one that's done 2 months subsequent to that. So kind of the final revision on GDP. So huge swings. So as you go, the more variations or revisions you go through, the more data points you've got feeding in. And so as you feed in more data points, in theory, the more accurate that estimate's going to be. And one thing they talk about is just healthcare in general. So when you're trying to look at the impact of healthcare on GDP, and healthcare has been exponentially, expenditures on healthcare have just been exponentially increasing over the last few years. One thing that makes it really difficult to see what the true impact of healthcare is that a lot of healthcare claims have a significant lag, or they're slow to come in and hit the system. So you go into your doctor's office today, probably not today because they're not open on Saturday. But let's say you go in on Monday morning to your doctor's office and you see your physician and you think you've got, you've got the flu. And so he provides some pharmaceuticals. He gives you an examination. If he wants to rule out pneumonia, he may do a chest X-ray. By the way, while you're there, they may do some blood work. And so you have consumed a bundle of healthcare services on a Monday morning. And then what happens is that claim, or all those services, go to a business office. They generate a claim for your services. And after you've paid your copay or coinsurance, whatever you're on the hook for there, then they may take that claim. That doctor's billing office takes that claim and submits it. They may submit it. You may be if you're a private pay, you're going to pay the full load yourself. But if you're with a health plan, the claim goes to health plan. If you're a traditional Medicare, it may go directly to the government or whoever the claims adjudicator is for traditional Medicare. Medicaid, it may go somewhere else. If it's a free clinic for an indigent population, you may not have any financial obligation. But anyway, these services are bundled up and submitted. And it's in the provider's best interest to submit that claim as quickly as possible, because it improves his cash flow and improves his revenue stream. Well, and a lot of providers, if they're efficient, they will bill either weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. But if they're not efficient and their office staff isn't that great, what you will find is some claims, it takes forever for it to hit the system and forever to flow into GDP, because there is this huge lag on the system. Some health plans have written into the contracts that if the provider doesn't submit the claims within 180 days, let's say after services provided, they don't get the claim paid. Some states have a billing cycle for the provider. It has to be done within a year. Some has to be done within 2 years. So, and also you will see, depending on what the provider's fiscal year is. If the provider's got a January to December fiscal year, you see a huge influx of claims coming in November, December, where providers are trying to get that money so that they can count it toward, in this instance, it'll be 2023 tax year. If they have a fiscal year that runs July to June 30th, you'll see the same thing in May and June, just a huge kind of flurry or bump. They're trying to collect everything so they get it in on that tax year. And it kind of mitigates not only it helps bring in money and generate revenue, but it helps kind of smooth out that tax burden. And so that's what you're talking about with revisions. The second thing they talk about is the service sector. And how do you estimate the value of a service sector? I mean, you can look at the quantity of services provided in a service sector, and they throw out healthcare and banks especially banks as how do you estimate the value of the service provided by the bank? You can look at number of dollars in accounts, you can look at number of accounts, you can look at number of individuals that are employed by the bank. You look at number of individuals employed in a healthcare setting. But when you're looking at service sector, it gets really difficult to value or to assign a dollar value to that particular good or service. Also in the service industry, and they say it's about 2/3 of economic activity in the United States. You've also got, as I mentioned before, you've got landscapers, you've got the high school individual that mows your yard, you've got a pool dude that comes by and services your swimming pool if you have one. You've got, and a lot of these, especially when we lived in Ohio, we paid the guy, the kid down the street to mow our yard, and I paid him in cash. So did he report it to the IRS? Probably not. If you use babysitters, most times a babysitter's paid in cash. Does that babysitter, provide that information to the IRS? Probably not. You hear pet sitters and home sitters, and they're usually working on a cash basis. And how much of that do they report to the Internal Revenue? Or take a waitress or a waiter in a restaurant, service individuals in a restaurant, the workers in the back of the restaurant. A lot of that dollar, so assigning dollar values, you can kind of guesstimate at the quantity side, but assigning dollar values makes it extremely difficult in the labor market in that service industry. Because remember, real GDP, or GDP just in general, measures market activity. And it's interesting, they get into market activity. They talk about household production. And I think of growing up, and when I have a brother and a sister, and when we were younger, my mother was a school teacher, but when we were younger, she stayed, she dropped out of being a school teacher and raised us at home. We didn't call it homeschooling at that time, but she was a taskmaster, and she provided a lot of supplemental, or maybe in some instances complementary services that the school system provided. She cooked and cleaned and managed the garden, and we raised on a farm, so we didn't buy a lot of groceries. Everything we pretty much tried to raise ourselves. So there was a lot of value there in that household that was never reported to GDP because nothing took place in the market. So, and you see a lot of parents now even going back to homeschooling and trying to do more work at home, trying to eat more at home, trying to not pay for goods and services out in the marketplace. So, household productions is an issue. You've got the underground economy. A lot of people even a lot of people in the area where I live in Atlanta, there's somewhat of a barter system here. You do some work for them and they turn around and do some work for you, and there's nothing paid out on the market system. And that productivity and that consumption is never captured in GDP. You've got, they talk about drugs and crime and prostitution and everything that kind of goes on in this underground or underground economy that it's outside of the market that's never captured in GDP. Now, some of it's going to be potentially harmful to the well-being of society, but in a barter economy, that's going to be a positive impact on the well-being, but it's not going to be captured within GDP. And then they talk about, when you get into well-being, they talk about the leisure economy. People calling it, you've got X number of days at work that you can take it, depending on how your benefits structured. I don't know whether too many companies anymore have a set sick bank and a set, vacation bank, and they're two separate pools of days that you can take. But definitely, if they have a sick bank still setting out there of days that you get for every year, usually those sick days don't roll over. So you saw a huge bump up in flu days in November and December every year, because people they knew they were going to lose that, so they were going to use it, and it was for their well-being. They were still going to get paid, but they didn't have to go to work. So, but that wasn't really captured in that market economy or really captured in the GDP. And then it actually, where they talk about it, ignores the bads. And so I think they give the example, GDP, you may be more diligent, in, putting up security systems yourself. So you may be buying the system itself, but you're not paying somebody to put it up if crime is rampant. You've also got, they talk about an epidemic and its impact on healthcare, and you saw that in 2020, 2021 with COVID. You're going to continue to see that going forward, epidemics. And so it kind of ignores the bads in some instances. And so it doesn't necessarily get calculated in GDP. One last thing that or a couple last things that they talk about is, in GDP, nothing is really talked about on income distribution. If you go back to the per capita, let's say the per capita real GDP for the United States was, I don't know, let's say it's $50,000. I don't know, just pick a number. If that is the average in the United States, it doesn't really talk about the well-being of the entire population and income distribution. Okay, it's an average, let's say, but what does, when you're looking at statistics, you're picking the averages also. So you've got the mean, which is the average, you've got the median, which is kind of the exact middle, and you've got the mode, which is the most frequent occurrence. And then they don't even look at standard deviation. So you've almost got to take and look at all of those statistical metrics to get the full view of what it does with income distribution in the United States. Because if it's 50,000, that 50,000, whatever that number is probably not a true representative of income distribution in the United States, or maybe even in any other global economy. So it doesn't account for income distribution. And then lastly, they talk about, again, and I've mentioned it multiple times, GDP may be flawed, whether it's nominal, whether it's real, whether it's per capita, may be flawed, but until we develop a metric that more accurately represents or quantifies reality, then GDP is probably the best we have at this point in time. That wraps it up for chapter 5. The next time you see me, we'll jump into chapter 6. And I think, if I remember correctly, chapter 6 talks about price level and inflation, and we'll start to dig into that in chapter 6. Until then, Have a great rest of the day and talk to everybody soon.